Well, thank you as always, Alexis, for all your work on this, and thank you, John, for agreeing to present. And for those of you who have joined us on many of our webinars, you know that we have tended, and the Institute tends to focus a lot on upstream oil and gas, midstream natural gas, gas and power, and a lot of the, well, I guess could be called traditional energy. So we're really happy to have John, and Alexis mentioned that John is the Managing Director of IPD Latin America, based in Bogota. John has been in Bogota, I think, about 6 years now, or at least 5. And he moved there from Mexico, and he's worked. He's the co-founder and managing director of IPD Latin America, which is a strategic advisory consultancy that also works in Peru and Venezuela, where John's partner in crime, as it were, David Vogt, is focused. In talking with John over the last several months, obviously Colombia and the story of Colombia's oil and gas sector and Colombia's broader energy story is something we've looked at for several years. And in talking with John, we said that something that perhaps wasn't getting as much attention and deserved so, or at least deserved a better assessment, was the renewable energy sector. And there have been some great strides made, especially on the biofuel side over the last several years. But more generally speaking, what's going on in renewables is something that we thought would be wonderful. And we said, John, let's tap your expertise and your team's expertise in Bogota to talk about this morning, that topic. And I think the two final things I'll say is I'm very interested in listening to what John has to say, not just about renewables in Colombia, but as we have done some of our other webinars, one of the questions that comes up, obviously, is the low oil price and low oil price environment that's been around for several months and looks to stay in terms of the near-distant future. What does that mean for renewables, obviously in this case in Colombia, but more largely? And I think right now, at least according to when we had our webinar with the gentleman from BP, this time around, this oil price collapse is not killing renewables. And so it'll be interesting to see what that means in Colombia, where the oil price collapse has indeed had an impact on at least the fiscal side of the equation for the federal government there. And I'm also very curious to see what the latest on biofuels in Colombia, because there was at least I think in the mid to late 2000s, a strong push on biofuels in Colombia. So we appreciate John's participation. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him. And as Alexis said, we'll moderate a Q&A discussion here at the end. So John Padilla, Managing Director, IPD Latin America, over to you. Thanks so much for joining us, as always.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you, Alexis. Pleasure to be with all of you from Europe as well as here in the hemisphere. As Alexis said, I'm joining you here from Mexico City. A lot of activity here, certainly with the energy reform from upstream to downstream. But the focus of today is renewables in Colombia, and I think renewables in general, just as Jeremy was saying, the amount of activity I think has been very, very interesting to watch in spite of the oil price collapse. And the level of activity is not been depleting from what we've been seeing. And I think a lot of it is just as we continue to see a lot of cost reduction, and countries like Colombia and others in the region trying to grapple with how they put that into the grid. So I think there's probably a number of people that have joined the call because of Law 1715 that was passed last year. And it's gained the attention of the international community. There are a lot of renewables in Colombia, and now we're kind of going through what I would call the fits and starts of trying to put the legislation or the secondary legislation in place that is going to hopefully allow for broader activity. So with that as kind of an introduction, I will go ahead and see if I can maneuver this. Yes, I do have the control. All right, and just start out a little bit with the overall, just an overall macro look on Colombia and its electricity sector. And overall, it has installed capacity of about a little over 15,000 megawatts. That makes it the 6th largest in Latin America. And like a lot of South American countries, it's incredibly hydro-dependent. So that creates a kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that it can create some very cheap sources of power, but when El Nino hits, it creates a lot of chaos. We highlighted 8 different regions in the country that, when you combine them together, make up about 93% of total demand, and that is 90% of the population. And if you actually just take the 5 largest regions there, you see that that actually accounts for over 81% of total demand. So highly, highly concentrated sources of consumption of electricity, and then the rest is basically off the grid. So what they call the non-interconnected areas, or ZNIs. There is a tremendous amount of indigenous communities, African Colombian communities. They tend to be fairly marginalized, and the terrain, for anybody that has been in Colombia will know, is just incredibly complex. So fairly remote parts of the country. And so as you see there, that adds another 165 megawatts of power. It's expensive power, as I'll show, and it's intermittent. So when we then take a look at electricity rates, the first thing that should probably jump out to you is that, wow, there should be a lot of room for improvement and a lot of running room for renewables, just based on the cost of electricity. So as you can see on the left-hand graph on the left-hand side, the generation makes up roughly about 37.5% of the total cost that goes into the electricity tariffs. And then what happens on the residential side in Colombia is it's cross-subsidized. So it's fairly social in its basis, and it happens in all of those regions that I highlighted in the last slide. So the poorer sectors 1, 2, and 3 is the way they have it set up in Colombia. They receive subsidies, and then the users that are in 4, 5, and 6 basically pay amounts that are up and above. As you can see, it's not a zero-sum game, and there are a fair amount of subsidies that the government actually then pays out. And when you kind of put that all in context, with including the subsidies for the ZNIs, because again, that electricity is basically coming off of diesel, and it's expensive electricity. So there's an additional $75 million of subsidies there. The government total subsidies are close to $600 million, and that represents nearly 65% of the budget. You know, there are some transmission losses, distribution losses that are in here, but I'm not going to really focus on those items here. It's a level of detail that I think is probably safe for a better day. So when we take a look at the entire energy mix in Colombia, electricity mix, what you see is the 70% coming from hydro, and then you have 11%, which is gas-fired. A lot of that is up towards the coast, where you do have much hotter temperatures, and as a result, air conditioning is consumed much more significantly, as is coal. And the issues that you kind of run into with respect to renewables is it starts out with just the abundance of water. And I don't have the statistic right off the top of my head, but I think Colombia has nearly about, is like the third or fifth largest country with water. So there's just an abundance of water. There's been some bad, I guess, community company relations in the past, particularly with the mining sector. So it's a very sensitive topic, which we'll take a look at in a little bit. And so for renewables, the other item then becomes, high cost versus efficiency, and then reliability, which I think is always one of the biggest issues that you run into within the Americas, as to 24/7 kind of capacity. The other item that we very much identify is just a lack of true understanding of the potential in the market. So I think that's fantastic for developers, people that are looking to see how they can participate in this market, and also kind of influence the process, because I think there's still a lot of learning that needs to take place. So yeah, let me move on from that one. What we put together here was essentially the dispatch that takes place in Colombia, and you can see the spot price where that's dispatched. So typically, what's getting released is hydro, and on the right-hand side, you can see the breakouts of where the spot price is in relation to hydro, coal, and then at the very, very top, you can see diesel. So, I mean, there are three dispatch models, but this is the dispatch that is being used that would be of interest if you're looking to sell excess capacity into the grid. Okay, so when we take a look at renewables in Colombia, they represent, when you include mini hydro, nearly 5% of the total installed capacity. As you can see, mini hydro, both less than 10 megawatts and then 10 to 20 megawatts, that's the definition that is used in Colombia, represents the lion's share of that activity to date. There's only one wind project, which is Hepirachi, which is in La Guajira. So that, just in terms of reference, is in the most northeastern part of the country. It's also where a lot of gas is being produced as well. And so most of the research at this stage has been coming through private sector utilities, EPM, which is one of the big utilities there out of Medellin, and then ISAGEN. And then that's been supported by kind of public entities as well. So what we wanted to do is, I mean, this is all a kind of a macro oversight of what we're seeing in the renewable sector and the potential that we have. So we're doing just a quick highlight on wind, on solar, on geothermal. And so on wind, you can see that the biggest potential is up there in the most northeast corner, La Guajira Peninsula. So that borders right with Venezuela. And the potential there, as well as the potential there up in the Caribbean coast, right to the left, is really the largest that has been identified by the UPME, which is the regulator. And they have worked fairly closely with IDB at this stage, really much more on the kind of research side, trying to identify activity, et cetera. When we take a look at solar, what we see here is that there's the largest solar facility was recently put online. It's 508 kilowatts up in Barranquilla, and that's kind of one of the areas that people have identified as being the highest potential. So what we did is we just took a look at how that ranks compared to other places around the world. And so you can see that it's kind of in the range. It's not super fantastic, but it's not bad either. So it's within this scan of how solar energy is measured. It's below Mexicali in Mexico, where there's been increased activity. There's a big plant being developed there by Innova or Sempra with BP, et cetera. So you can also kind of just take a look here at some of the estimated potential that they have at this stage in the country. Geothermal, I'm sorry, before we turn to geothermal, so this is the case study on the Barranquilla plant that was built. And this is, the group that developed it is Green Yellow. They're part of Grupo Casino, which is a French company that also owns Grupo Éxito. And so this just came online in March. And, Éxito, the group basically has a view of trying to create energy savings as well as just creating a better reputation in the market. I think the interesting thing that's, and it's a case study that's worth really kind of looking at in detail, is that the ability to sell the excess power on the grid doesn't pay. So the map, the Google map that we included there, it may be hard to see, but on the left-hand side, that's where the solar panels were installed. But Grupo Éxito, actually, that facility there, which is called Éxito Panorama, that's only half of the roof. So all the right-hand side could be installed capacity, but that would not be for self-consumption. That would be for excess supply that they would sell back into the grid. The power is cheaper than what they're buying off of the grid, based off of the amortization and how they're amortizing the investment, but it's not good enough to sell into the grid and actually make money. So, it's a kind of a classic case of some of the complexities that you're seeing, and then we'll talk about Law 1715 and how that applies, and why that all matters. And a lot of it just comes down to incentives, and then how you're treating access to the grid. Okay, so we turn over to geothermal. Geothermal has, by and large, been the neophyte, I guess, on the block in terms of renewables. It absolutely, Colombia sits in the ring of fire, as you can see on the lower left-hand side map. But there's only been one well drilled to date, and it was a dry hole. But the potential here, I think, anybody that has spent any time in Colombia knows, just outside of Bogota, in any direction, you can hit thermal baths. So not necessarily the same kind of quality of geothermal resource, but there is geothermal resource there. The question will be, is it sufficiently adequate for commercial purposes? But in general terms, I think there's a lot to be done on this front. There's a lot to be looked at. I think one of the challenges will be just the drilling, onshore issues, as we'll talk about a little bit later, have become fairly complicated on the social and permitting front. All right, so turning to policy and regulation. Kind of where we stand right now. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of take a look at this from a macro perspective and where renewables potentially fit into the mix. And from the macro perspective, it's interesting to appreciate and understand that IDEAM, which is the Hydrology, Meteorology, and Atmospheric Studies Institute in Colombia, is projecting less rain precipitation for 2011 to 2040, all basically related to climate change. And I mean, there's certainly a number of companies that are quite concerned about this phenomena as well. The other issue that you really run into is El Nino. So everything's fantastic until all of a sudden El Nino shows up, and then all bets are off, and everybody's scrambling for electricity, but nobody wants to pay for it. So it's kind of the same adage that we've seen repeated numerous times in numerous places. I think the other factor to keep in mind is that there's increasing social and environmental licensing challenges for large-scale hydro generation plants. So in other words, siting another large-scale hydro plant is unlikely to really materialize, I think, in Colombia, certainly in the short to medium term. And so one of the advantages is certainly a diversified energy basket. That to date has really been dependent on gas and coal principally, and diesel, as we talked about in the Z&I areas. So there's clearly a role for renewables going forward, and I think it's one of the issues, one of the fundamental issues will be reliability, and then how you put it kind of into the mix. Z&Is, there's clearly a need to reduce the dependence on diesel. It's expensive, and I think the issue there as well is that if you could create renewable sources that can complement and create greater connectivity over a 24-hour period, that will be positive, expanding coverage, and then economic development in a post-conflict scenario. So, if in fact the peace process is reached, the question is how are you going to start stimulating economic activity in a lot of these areas? And this is certainly at the forefront of the things that will need to be addressed. How that will be handled, et cetera, are bigger issues, and how you get those local populations to pay, or how you get paid in general, I think are some of the items. On the political front, I mean, what we've seen is that Colombia moved very quickly. They expressed interest in becoming a member of IRENA, and then that was the very next year they became members. So that was positive. I mean, this is part of this administration's efforts to become much more of a international citizen, I would say, which is all positive, and kind of be in the realm of a lot of international activity. So that's all very positive. What we don't see is we don't really kind of see a political champion right now, apart from UPME. And UPME as a regulator is really got fairly limited powers of influence. So it's not really a priority in Congress, and as you would suspect, not all stakeholders in Colombia want to necessarily see renewables succeed. All right, so what I laid out here was just a time frame in terms of what has happened with respect to renewables in Colombia. And that really, you have to go back to 2001 when Law 699 was passed and looked to create energy efficiency. And so renewables were declared a public interest and national convenience. But in large respect, kind of platitudes at that stage, at that point, really setting the stage for the development of the other activities that needed to take place. So in 2003, we saw the PROURE created, which was an indicative action plan for rational use of energy and non-conventional energy sources. So all renewables, essentially. Co-generators were allowed to sell excess energy to the grid starting in 2008, but that again then means that you are cost competitive. So if you were cost competitive, then that allowed you to sell your excess supply. There was an action plan in 2010, and then the big news has been the law 1715 that was passed in May of last year for renewables. And so there were incentives that were laid out with respect to the law, which I'll talk about on the next slide here. But it laid out the general kind of framework is the best way to kind of categorize that. And now what we're waiting on, which was targeted to be released in May, were kind of the secondary regulations, which are how you actually access those incentives. And that is still what is pending at this stage. I think that in general terms, well, let me start with Law 1715, and then we can talk about kind of where we are with respect to the secondary legislation. So these are the main components that, or the relevant items that that are trying to be addressed in Law 1715 with respect to renewables. So I think Colombia is very similar to what you see in the region. There's not interest to kind of follow the European model of setting fixed prices, which implies direct subsidies or higher prices to end users. And so they want the market to basically be able to compete. So getting from that kind of idea to reality, I think, is some of the growing pains that we're going through, at this point. There's several incentives, and I mean, I'm going to focus more on the incentives part because I think that's really the driver of the economic activity and where people will look to develop projects and invest in the sector. So there's basically there's different incentives that are all related to the fiscal side. The first is on income tax reduction, and income tax reduction is a maximum of 50% of the investment in 5 years. And what they've said, or what has come out right now with the decree or the draft of the decree, is that it can't be combined with other tax incentives or accelerated depreciation, which is one of the other incentives that's been put on the table. And that's kind of made a lot of people scratch their head because if it can't be combined, that really diminishes the value of the incentive. I think that the thing that's worth understanding is that the law doesn't say that they can't be combined, and that's important because a decree or secondary legislation can't overrule the law. So the law itself is pretty clear on the point, and it would suggest that that's going to move forward, but we're still kind of going through some growing pains on that front. The other is access to VAT reductions. So as you can imagine, the government's in the process or the UPME is basically creating a standard list of assets and elements that can be, or services as well, that can be exempted from VAT. And then there's tariff exemptions, which will, this one gets a little bit interesting. in the sense that, as I understand it, it's only that if the investor proves that the imported elements were, not produced in Colombia. So I mean, that should actually be, fairly straightforward. Going back on that, the item is also if, or actually it's on the tariff. They'll have to demonstrate that there's some procedural items that don't necessarily fit very well with people right now, because the product has to be in the port already before you go through the procedures. So then you're sitting, potentially, if this all moves forward, you're sitting with the asset and not able to move it forward until you get this all resolved. So, I mean, procedural bureaucracy with the decree are the problems. And then the other incentive is accelerated depreciation. So those are the items that have been put on the table. I think the one thing that we're still at a crossroads on is, because there's not going to be a feed-in tariff, this is net metering. So this is only a trade-off, but it only works if you can put excess capacity onto the grid. And I think what's being discussed right now, which is or being debated, is whether they will allow for some type of reliability-like tariff to be applied. So is there a value for the renewables to be part of the electricity mix? I think some of the things that I've pointed out here create compelling reasons. And so then the question is, will you pay renewable generators some type of tariff to kind of function as a reliability type of factor? That's the item that is absolutely in debate, and I think probably one of the items that is creating the most consternation right now, and why we haven't seen the secondary laws released at this point. Okay, so kind of looking forward, these are the projections that the government has put out, but the government itself says that its projections are conservative. Not necessarily a view that is shared by the industry, but they believe that the government, that there should be a greater impact from Law 17. That could be true if, in fact, Law 17 is implemented well and the incentives work in the way that really facilitate activity. But that, I think, is always the big question. So when you take a look at the pessimistic scenario, the numbers here are a little bit different. So as I had pointed out previously, there's just a little bit less than 5% of installed capacity from renewables. Here, what's different is that the mini hydro is not included in these numbers. So if you add the mini hydro back in, that's where you get to a status quo perspective. So the government is very conservatively saying, well, if Law 17 basically doesn't work, we'll stay at roughly about 5% or 2% when you exclude mini hydros. The moderate then pops that up to 6 or 7, or if you include mini hydro, 9 to 10%, and you can see the mix of what's included there. And then on the optimistic side, it grows to 10–15% without mini hydro. And what you can see is that the large piece of that pie is coming from wind. And that's just because they have a much better handle, I think, on wind than they have on geothermal or even solar. And so, I think companies are making their own assumptions as to what that will possibly mean, depending on what the final state of the renewable law is really how it takes shape. So what we wanted to do is kind of take a look at both opportunities and challenges, both for the national grid as well as the unconnected areas throughout the country. And I think one of the very first things that's important to understand is that renewables absolutely have the ability to provide a counter-cycle type of source of supply. So when hydro during El Nino takes place, that is going to mean that you're typically going to have much hotter weather, and you possibly will have much higher amounts of wind. So this could actually work as a balancing factor, which is, I think, quite compelling and quite interesting. We've already talked about diversification of backup sources of supply, and the big question then is the items that I already talked about, which is really the incentives. So what will be the final tally on fiscal related incentives, and then will they put in place a reliability charge type incentive? You know, the challenges and some of the negatives right now is just very slow regulation development and progress, something that we've seen across the energy sector space and mining sector space. And, you know, the question is there really a political will to get this done in true action form? So, you know, moving from the platitudes to what's going to actually drive activity. Right now, the incentives, or more than just saying incentives for broad level activity, I think it's just it's the system. So one thing that you don't have, and they didn't put in place, was some type of auction scheme. So, you know, being able to have some type of, if you could lock into a guaranteed supply, I mean, I think then developers are more keen to bid more aggressively, and you can get it works out on both sides. There is definitely opposition and lobbying from traditional generators, as would be expected, and there's no political interest to offer up subsidies, as we talked about. The prior consultation process and licensing in Colombia has absolutely become a major issue. And so if we just take a look at the case of the Heperachi wind farm, that took 3 years to go through the prior consultation process. So it's a little bit of buyer beware. These are things that are affecting the entire industry and sector, and something that you'll want to pay close attention to if you do move forward with a project. When we take a look over on the unconnected areas of the country, it really does provide an opportunity to boost economic activity in neglected areas, provided that you can get paid and that these can be viable. Wind and solar will certainly be more efficient and cheaper than diesel, and the counter-seasonal cycles that we talked about are absolutely a plus. This, you know, as I talked about before, it could spur economic activity. But the other thing to keep in mind is that there's oil and gas, as well as mining activities in a number of these regions, and they do need electricity. So most of those are using diesel as well, because that's what they can get down in their facilities. So this can definitely be a win-win activity from both sides of the fence. And then, you know, the question is, really, is this part of the post-conflict strategy? Because if you're going to reintegrate FARC members into society, you're going to need economic vehicles to create jobs and activity. So renewables, from a very, you know, 10,000-foot view, could help spur that. You know, again, the question, as we put on the lower half, is who's going to pay, and you know, are you going to, you know, what's the role of the government going to be? How active are they going to be on that front? We talked about security and social issues in these regions, and you know, the presence of ethnic communities is significant, and so that's why those prior consultation processes by law have to take place, and could be time consuming if we don't start seeing some shortening of processes and support from the government. And then there's obviously logistical challenges, which I think you know, goes without saying. So just as we kind of wrap up here, I wanted to quickly just kind of put Colombia into perspective as it relates to its peers. I think Chile continues to be kind of the best of the group in terms of spurring activity. At this stage, Mexico is, as I mentioned at the onset, is going through its energy reform. There will be a wholesale market here, and we'll see also the development or the use of cells, which are the certificates for clean energy that are being developed. There's been some good activity in Peru. But, in general terms in the region, what you've seen is that there's been a major interest in renewables. And most of them, as I mentioned, is not a feed-in tariff. It's much more focused on net metering schemes. And then the other big issue is really access to financing, something I'll kind of wrap up my presentation with. With respect to Colombia, I think our view is that there's still a ways to go in terms of, and again, it's beyond incentives. Incentives is one piece of the pie, but it's really accessing the grid properly and really being able to generate a business so that it's not just self-generation projects, et cetera. That will be then, the definition, I think, of success of renewables in Colombia, should it occur. And because right now, as I've mentioned, as I've alluded to, there's just a limited kind of state commitment and public commitment to the effort. So it's happening. There are people absolutely working hard on this stuff, but it doesn't mean that all pieces of the machinery are all in lockstep and moving forward. So just kind of wrapping up with financing, I think that there's some interesting takeaways. We've spent a fair amount of time talking with different folks. And I mean, I think the first thing that you see is that the local banks are really, at this stage, fairly, generally speaking, ill-equipped to undertake these projects thus far, and they're going to probably need some incentives from the government. So when you then turn to kind of multilaterals, and the other thing is that lending in general in Colombia right now, as the economy has been sliding in light of oil prices, a phenomena we're seeing in a number of other places, including here in Mexico. There's just not a lot of lending going on. So they're very, very tight with their balance sheets right now. And then on the multilateral front, I think that the one thing that we're seeing is that there's not really been a lot of active discussion between government and multilaterals as how they're going to promote that. Maybe that's next. Hopefully that's next. But we think that particularly when you look at ZNIs, that will be one of the compelling factors that will really be a go, no-go type of decision for development in those areas. I mean, there's always exceptions. There's always certain niches that you can tap into. And then for grid projects as well, how multilaterals can really play a very significant role. So, I think, the entities that we've laid out here, the IDB, the IFC, CAF, et cetera, they're doing activity, but I mean, to the level where, there's a very concerted effort, I think we're still a ways away from that. And I think anybody that started to look at funding options in Colombia would probably echo those sentiments. So I will leave it at that. I'm joined by two of my colleagues in Colombia, Sergio Torres and Maria Claudia Diaz, who are infinitely more attuned to the details. And if there are certain questions that I simply can't answer, I'll have them join in and help answer those questions to the extent that there are some. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I appreciate you ending with the financing slide because that was actually something I scribbled down in the course of the presentation. And when I introduced you, I neglected to mention your career as a banker before you went on to help found IPD. And so what I want to talk about is you talked about multilaterals. Help all of us understand a little bit better about the bankability question of renewables, because that's sort of always, no matter which market you look at, there's a huge question about bankability. Are we talking in Colombia the need for long-term PPAs, renewable-only auctions? I think you mentioned that's something that hasn't happened. What are, in your opinion right now, some of the things that need to happen in terms of spurring the bankability of renewable projects in Colombia?
Well, traditional banking is always looking for surety. And so typically that comes in the form of long-term offtake contracts. So the success of IPPs, for instance, in the U.S. was generated off of long-term contracts that had a fixed component that could amortize the debt, and then a variable component depending on whether there was dispatch. So I'm speaking very specifically towards gas-fired cogeneration that really kind of was some of the bread and butter that I spent a tremendous amount of time on during my banking career. I think multilaterals here could play a very important role, particularly in the disconnected areas of the country, because these are, in many respects, some of the same places that are conflict-ridden. So, nobody's going to go in there without some type of, if it's not going to be a government guarantee, and there doesn't seem to be an interest on the government's part to provide that kind of level of support, you're going to want somebody that's going to take some of that risk off of you in terms of sovereign risk, in terms of ability to pay, depending on who's your off-taker, et cetera. So the other role that multilaterals frequently can play is they can just be an incredibly cost-competitive source of financing. And so for projects and for renewable projects, as prices, cost of production of renewables goes down, getting a little additional support, and particularly you have entities like IDB and CAF that have mandates to support clean energy projects, et cetera. This is all, it should, I would expect, let's put it that way, my personal expectation would be that we would see a tremendous more amount of activity than what we've encountered thus far. It's not to say that, again, it's not happening, it's just, I think it's a fantastic fit of objectives of both, multilaterals as well as what the government is trying to achieve.
Excellent. And then I forgot, I jumped in with a question, but I forgot to remind everyone, as Alexis noted at the outset, there is an icon on your right-hand side there, a little image of a person with a question mark, and that gives you the opportunity to type a question that I can drag onto the screen here for John to respond to. There was a couple things I want to get to that we're going back and forth in the chat, but first, something else that seemed to pop up, and I had a question about as well. I think it would be good to talk a little bit about the gas question, and so let me try and drag this question up. And the question is a fairly specific one, but let me add to it something I think was interesting, because I heard you, and I hope I heard you correctly, say that La Guajira has some of the largest wind potential in Colombia, and I tend to believe that that's probably the same location where most of Colombia's natural gas potential is located as well. So let's talk a little bit about the gas and renewable interchange here, and then this specific question of why is domestic gas power not projected to take a growing slice of installed capacity in, I guess, what you put up as optimistic, moderate, pessimistic cases on one slide.
I absolutely agree with the question. Maria Claudia Diaz and myself recently pinned um, a small article that was published in the World Gas Forum. I'm butchering the name right now, but it was in Paris. It just took place. It was a big conference in June. And the potential for gas in Colombia, production of gas to grow, in our view, is incredibly high. We think that what you're seeing with La Guajira is that production is falling. But then you have Cusiana, which has basically about a BCF per day of gas that they re-inject, I'm rounding numbers here, simply to maintain oil production. Oil production has fallen quite a bit. Oil prices aren't helping. But the issue that you have with Cusiana gas is that it's liquid rich, and it'll require some pretty significant investment, which right now the contract that Ecopetrol has with Echion is set to expire, and the question is, will it be renewed? Will it be put in place with a third party? We've also seen that Venezuela is potentially, they've announced that they're looking to potentially reverse the flow, or at least stop importing gas from Colombia. And then on top of that, there is quite a significant amount of drilling activity offshore, and everybody is hoping, praying, quite frankly, that they're going to find oily deposits. But I think people are resigned to the fact that there's going to be, even if they do find oily deposits, there's going to be a fair amount of gas that's associated with it. And this gets to a much bigger topic, and it's not just Colombia, it's throughout the region, is that I think we're in a stage globally where there's been some just massive amounts of gas finds. And what it's really kind of setting up a world of is a world where we're going to have a lot of stranded gas. And so all those players and people that thought that they could just put in place small little projects and export whatever gas they had, if you're not Bolivia and just don't have any consumption, so you might as well, you better monetize that and get it through pipeline to other places, I think are going to find themselves in a situation where they're going to need to develop local gas markets. So this is not in the thinking of what you see in the projection numbers, but I wholeheartedly agree with the question, because I think push or shove, Colombia is very much in the position that the U.S. was in the 1970s before Congress approved the development of Kenai, the LNG terminal, export terminal in Alaska. And it was changing the methodology in which you were calculating whether you had enough, if you were resource dependent, self-sufficient on the gas side. And so the way that Colombia kind of calculates its gas, I mean, if you're in country or you followed it closely, there's always a question of, do we have enough gas? Will there be enough gas for the next El Nino, et cetera. And I think we're going to move very rapidly in a completely different direction, and that's going to require the development of, I think, a lot of industrial activity, electricity consumption, petrochemical activity. Colombia touts itself as the gateway to the Pacific. But it needs a lot of infrastructure, and then it needs gas. So I think it's going to be a very interesting decade to see where things shift, going forward. How that then affects renewables, in the short term, maybe, unknown. And I think it's just a matter of as renewable costs come down, and if you get a policy in place that will at least incentivize, renewables properly and see that there's a value there in diversification and the other items that I pointed out, I think that will find its way into the mix regardless.
Yeah, and I think if, you talk about the reliability issue, I think what we see around a lot of parts of the hemisphere is the idea of really the firming of renewables with gas. So I think it's something like you said that's something to keep our eye on. I don't want to leave some of these other questions out. We probably talked about gas and gas to power for a while, but let's talk about something here on the biomass biofuel side. And the question is pretty specific about those sources. And if you could comment on the role of those sources in the Colombian economy and what are the potential.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is a big agriculture component. I mean, you head outside of Bogota into the Sabana de Bogota, and world-class flour production, and there's just a whole slew of activities, sugar, et cetera. I think that biomass has the potential, and again, I think this is where the government. It can't just be a national level effort. It also needs to be within the departments, and so getting kind of more pro-business driven departments supporting some of these activities, I think is where we'll need to see a level of activity, and that's where a lot of lobbying needs to be done.
Great. We're running out of time here. So, but let me put something up that there's actually a couple of comments, and I'll put them up on the screen, John, and then let you reflect upon them. During your presentation, there was a good deal of back and forth on the chat function about some of the hydrological comments and some of the projections I think that you based some of the numbers in the presentation on. So let me just put up two, these are more statements, but I will give you the opportunity to reflect upon them. And the statement is, it is important to mention that there is insufficient evidence today with models that show a highly significant decrease in hydrological inputs for the coming years. And the second part, I think, is more specific. You had mentioned the EDAM, and this says, when the EDAM said that there'd be less rain precipitations, whereas the documentation, this participant questioned the, I don't know if it's the veracity or where that information comes from. So I'll let you reflect on that. You probably have to end there on hydrological issues.
Yeah, I mean, if David is interested, feel free to get in touch with us, and we can discuss those items and get you sources on that. Not a problem.
Perfect. Well, look, it's just after 10 o'clock here in California, and I know John is actually, I think, running off to the airport, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't want to have you get stuck in traffic in Mexico City and miss your flight. We want to thank you for joining us and making the presentation. Very, very insightful. I mean, I think the fact of some of the things you mentioned as I was listening, especially on the licensing question, and some of you put that big down arrow. Boy, those sound a lot like a lot of the issues we've talked about for years on the oil and gas and the upstream side of the equation in Colombia's energy sector. So let's hope that some of those political will questions and some of those incentives and how they navigate those challenges come to fruition on all forms of energy in Colombia. Thanks again, John. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, and I'd be remiss if I didn't end by saying we'll be in Santiago, Chile next week. The Energy Program of the Institute of the Americas will have a roundtable in Santiago on June 23rd. We'll have a presentation here at our headquarters in La Jolla on renewables on the border, a report that the Wilson Center, USAID Mexico, and Green Momentum put together looking at northern border renewables in Mexico. And we'll have another webinar in July. Webinar on Peru's Energy Outlook 2030 with a couple of different speakers from Lima. And then we'll be back again with a webinar series. We'll actually hit 2 in July because we missed one in May. So we'll have another webinar on the future of natural gas in Venezuela, which interestingly has a link to the discussion today, especially that pipeline, the famous reversal of the pipeline from Venezuela. Thank you all again. We appreciate you joining us. Stay tuned, and thank you, Alexis, for managing our webinar series.